The very earth appeared to convulse, unleashing a guttural artillery salvo that rent the winter night. Within the impromptu surgical theater of what had once been a tranquil French village hospital, the unsteady lamplight flickered in sync with each concussive detonation. Rain assaulted the boarded-up windows, each droplet a staccato percussion against the relentless cadence of warfare. Upon a blood-drenched cot, Private Jack Miller, an American GI, teetered on the precipice of life. His exhalations shallow rasps, his leg a mangled atrocity. He was but one of countless souls, Allied and Axis alike, ensnared by the grim caprice of battle. Their sole commonality, the tenuous hope for respite beneath this beleaguered roof. Outside, the pandemonium coalesced into a symphony of devastation. German forces, embroiled in a desperate retrograde, waged their last stand, transforming the contiguous thoroughfares into a charnel house. The hospital, emblazoned with its Red Cross emblem, was ostensibly consecrated territory, a haven. Yet in the brutal arithmetic of conflict, such scruples frequently dissolved into oblivion. It was into this maelstrom that Colonel Klaus Richter materialized, his uniform immaculately pressed, notwithstanding the pervasive mire and despair that clung to every other surface. He was neither a medic nor present for the casualties. Richter was an engineer, an individual of exacting calculations and somber obligations, charged with the imperative of either securing or eradicating strategic material. His gaze, sharp and glacial, surveyed the grim tableau. Makeshift pallets, harried nurses, the palpable miasma of disinfectant and dread. He was in pursuit of an objective, a directive actualized, a mission consummated. His reconnaissance led him through the hospital's derelict recesses, past overflowing infirmaries and hushed arteries, descending into the damp, resonant sub-basements. The atmosphere grew dense, heavy with the scent of moist earth and an ancillary effluvium, a faint, coppery piquancy. Richter's flashlight beam bisected the tenebrosity, illuminating caches of medical provisions, abandoned crates, and then, interspersed amongst them, an anomaly of profound discordance. Concealed beneath dislodged floorboards, with painstaking artifice, lay not medical sustenance, but a series of explosive devices interconnected with a chilling meticulousness. His respiration faltered, a silent, almost imperceptible indrawn breath. This was no routine demolition. It was an insidious trap, a precisely orchestrated enterprise designed for the total obliteration of the edifice. The charges were armed, poised for ignition, perhaps at the first intimation of an Allied incursion or merely responsive to a predetermined temporal trigger. The ramifications struck him with the force of a physical blow. This was not merely a hospital, it was a powder keg, and every soul within its walls, German soldiers, Allied prisoners like Miller, the doctors, the nurses, even the local civilians seeking shelter, were unwitting victims. A cold dread coiled in his gut. His orders were clear. Destroy anything of strategic value that could fall into enemy hands. But this was different. This was indiscriminate slaughter. The lives above, those desperately fighting for another sunrise, would be snuffed out in an instant, not by enemy fire, but by a chilling act of his own side. He saw the faces of the wounded, the weary medical staff, the terrified children huddled in the basement. He was a soldier, yes, but he was also a man who understood the difference between combat and massacre. The choice, stark and terrible, materialized before him. Follow orders and allow the carnage, or defy them, risking everything, to save lives that, by all military logic, were expendable. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the detonator. The decision was not made with a shout or a dramatic gesture, but in the agonizing silence of that cellar. A silent war waged within his own conscience. Every tick of the distant clock seemed to echo the beating of his own heart, each beat a silent argument for humanity against the brutal dictates of war. He could walk away. He could pretend he hadn't seen. No one would ever know. But the image of Jack Miller, the young American bleeding out upstairs, flashed in his mind. Then the faces of the nurses, the German wounded, all innocent in this particular heinous act. With a grim set to his jaw, Klaus Richter began to work. His hands, usually steady and precise, trembled slightly as he meticulously, frantically, started to disarm the explosives, knowing that every second was a gamble, every snip of a wire a defiance of a command that could cost him his life. The rhythmic thud of distant shelling continued, a constant reminder of the world outside. a world that would never know the silent battle he fought in the damp, dark earth beneath the hospital. He was risking a court-martial, an execution, for men he was sworn to fight. The next morning, as the first grey light of dawn broke through the clouds, Private Jack Miller felt a strange, almost miraculous calm descend upon the hospital. The shelling had stopped. The air, though still thick with smoke, the cacophony of heavy artillery no longer reverberated through the air. He was alive. He had weathered the night. Yet the indelible marks, both corporeal and psychological, would remain with him for the duration of his existence. He would never be able to expunge the hospital, the gnawing fear, or the inexplicable deliverance from his memory. Decades hence, the conflict had receded into a faint reverberation, a spectral nightmare gradually fading from the collective consciousness of a reconfigured nation. Jack Miller, presently a patriarch residing in a tranquil suburban abode in Ohio, would occasionally awaken in a cold, clammy sweat, the phantom agonies of his fractured limb serving as a perpetual memento of that merciless wintry night. He had enjoyed a replete existence, nurtured a family, and witnessed the academic milestones of his progeny, but a fragment of that fateful night, an unresolved query, persisted. Why had the hospital, a conspicuous strategic objective, been miraculously spared from utter devastation? The official dispatches were perfunctory, alluding to an abrupt cessation of hostilities and a tactical redirection. However, Jack harbored an intuitive certainty, a visceral conviction that a more significant event had transpired. He had endeavored to consign it to oblivion, to enter the persistent disquiet, but the past invariably possessed an uncanny propensity for reappearance. On a particularly bracing autumnal afternoon, as foliage adorned his driveway in a resplendent tableau of amber and vermilion, an unadorned white envelope materialized in his mailbox. It bore no discernible point of origin, save for a stark, typewritten appellation, Jack Miller. Within its confines, no correspondence, no elucidation, only a solitary, desiccated photograph. It depicted a blurred image of a man attired in a German uniform, his visage obscured by an encroaching shadow, positioned within what appeared to be a subterranean hospital chamber, and beneath the photographic representation, a solitary pen-inscribed sentence, rendered in German, inadequately elucidated by an interlocutor. The ordinance was rendered inert. Your continued existence is attributable to a decision. That single faded photograph, its stark translated message etched upon it, became an anchor in Jack Miller's quiet Ohio existence. It was more than a mere image. It was a spectral echo from his past, a silent indictment and an irrefutable verity. The words, "The bombs were disarmed. You owe your life to a choice," reverberated in his consciousness, shattering the precarious tranquility he had painstakingly cultivated over decades. He scrutinized the grainy depiction, the shadowed figure attired in a German uniform, and a veritable torrent of questions erupted. Who was this individual? Why dispatch this missive at this juncture? And what agonizing decision had been instrumental in preserving Jack's life and the lives of countless others on that unforgiving winter night? His grandchildren, visiting for Thanksgiving, discovered him poring over the photograph, a magnifying glass clutched in his hand. He attempted to elucidate, to articulate the seismic upheaval this envelope had precipitated, but the narrative felt too colossal, too scarcely credible for their tender ears. For weeks, the photograph remained his constant companion, ensconced in his shirt pocket, a tangible manifestation of a debt he had been oblivious to owing. He experienced an imperative, almost desperate yearning to locate this anonymous benefactor, to meet his gaze, to convey the gratitude that had been accumulating in silence for half a century. Jack, a man of ingrained routine and placid contemplation, metamorphosed into an indefatigable investigator. He commenced with the meager resources at his disposal, the photograph and the translated sentence. He frequented the local library, a sanctuary he typically patronized solely for its collection of historical fiction, and dedicated hours hunched over microfiche reels, meticulously sifting through old newspaper archives, seeking any reference to the hospital, the German retreat, or any unusual occurrences within that specific French hamlet. He consulted online forums devoted to World War II history, disseminating the image and the cryptic message, harboring the hope that someone somewhere, might discern a detail, a uniform insignia, anything at all. The internet, a tool he had previously grasped only peripherally, became his digital cartographer. He navigated through an abundance of fruitless avenues, each unanswered email or vacant search result, a minuscule jab of vexation. He contacted veteran organizations, the VFW post to which he had belonged for years, trusting that someone within their extensive network might have apprehended a whisper, a rumor, pertaining to a German officer who had defied directives. Yet the war had been a maelstrom, engorging innumerable untold narratives, and this particular one seemed resolute in its determination to remain interred. The quest consumed him entirely. Days blurred into weeks, then months. His family observed with a blend of apprehension and befuddlement as their typically placid patriarch succumbed to an obsession, his once unwavering hands now exhibiting a subtle tremor as he formulated another query or scrutinized another time-worn document. He apprehended the inexorable progression of time, a silent chronometer expending the residual moments available for two aging men to finally achieve a connection. He understood that, should this enigmatic German officer still be living, he, much like Jack, would be in his late 80s or 90s. The aperture of opportunity was constricting, and the prospect of never locating him, of never fathoming the complete verity, corroded his spirit. Then, just as despondency began to encroach, a breakthrough, albeit minor but significant, materialized. A retired professor of history from a modest institution in Michigan, an authority on German military engineering during World War II, responded to one of Jack's forum submissions. The professor, Dr. Elias Vance, did not recognize the individual in the photograph, but he did discern the context. He recalled arcane allusions within declassified records to a highly irregular occurrence involving a German engineer, Colonel Klaus Richter, in proximity to a French village infirmary during the concluding stages of the Ardennes offensive. Richter had been subjected to a court-martial and incarcerated for insubordination, a charge that appeared disproportionate given the official documentation. Dr. Vance had consistently harbored a suspicion of an underlying narrative, a missing component of the enigma. He had even discovered a faded, nearly illegible notation regarding Richter's eventual liberation and unobtrusive assimilation into post-war Germany. Equipped with a name, Jack's pursuit acquired renewed impetus. Dr. Vance, captivated by the ethical ramifications of the account, proffered his assistance, engaging his own extensive consortium of international historians and archivists. Weeks hence, an electronic mail arrived, containing a contemporary domicile in a diminutive municipality in Bavaria, Germany, and a telephone number. It represented a tenuous hope, a filament so delicate it felt poised to fracture under the sheer pressure of anticipation. Jack gazed at the numerals, his heart accelerating with a cadence he had not experienced since that night in the infirmary. This was it. This was the juncture of revelation. He rehearsed his intended discourse, myriad potential outcomes unfolding within his consciousness. What if the gentleman evinced no recollection? What if he evinced reticence? What if the interpreter he had engaged, a German-American woman from his congregation, proved incapable of bridging the temporal interregnum and the linguistic gulf? Drawing a profound inhalation, his hand quivering, Jack actuated the dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring stretched into an eternity. Then, a voice, raspy with age, responded in German. "Hello?" Jack's translator, Maria, spoke into the receiver in hushed tones, explaining Jack's identity, referencing the photograph, the message, the hospital. A protracted, weighty silence ensued on the other end, disturbed solely by the faint static of the transatlantic line. Jack held his breath, every nerve alight. He could almost perceive the man on the other side, revisiting half a century within that agonizing interlude. Subsequently, the voice returned, softer now, yet imbued with an undeniable tremor. Maria translated, her own voice barely audible. He says, "I was the engineer. I made the choice." The line abruptly disconnected. A profound stillness enveloped Jack's living room, punctuated only by the resonant ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The call had spanned a mere few minutes, yet it had traversed decades, bridged continents, and forged a connection between two souls inextricably linked by an act of profound audacity. The ensuing silence was not a void, rather, it was pregnant with the reverberations of a long-concluded war and the nascent comprehension that the man who had saved him was still extant. The enigma had been unraveled, but the narrative was far from concluded. The chime of the doorbell was more than mere sound. It was the prelude to a moment Jack Miller had anticipated for 70 years. The door creaked open, revealing a man bowed by time, his hair thin and white, yet his eyes still held the intensity of a life etched by impossible choices. Klaus Richter. There he stood, not the spectral figure from a faded photograph, but a man of flesh and bone who had borne the weight of a secret and the courage of a decision. No words were uttered immediately, only a long, profound gaze that traversed time, war, and oceans. Jack felt a lump in his throat, gratitude and emotion overwhelming him. Richter in turn observed the American veteran, a man he had saved, now a mirror of his own advanced age. Helga, the translator, who had become an indispensable bridge between the two, spoke softly in German, introducing Jack. Richter nodded, extending an aged, wrinkled hand, yet one that still conveyed a surprising firmness. Jack clasped it, and in that handshake decades of silence and a world conflict dissolved into mutual recognition. It was a handshake that transcended flags and allegiances, a bond forged in the crucible of war, sustained by an act of humanity. Richter led them into his modest yet impeccably ordered home, a reflection of a life lived with discipline and purpose. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as he prepared the beverage, his movements slow and deliberate. Seated at the kitchen table, bathed in the soft light filtering through the window, Jack began to speak, his words flowing with a sincerity that Helga translated with grace and precision. He spoke of the photograph, the relentless pursuit, and the enduring impact of Richter's choice on his own life. He expressed the debt of gratitude that had propelled him for so long, a debt he felt could only be repaid by this encounter. Richter listened, his gaze distant, as if reliving every detail of that fateful night. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy, his German words imbued with a stillness that Helga translated with equal reverence. He did not dwell on the technicalities of defusing the bombs. For him, the crux of the matter lay in the internal battle. He described the moral quandary that had tormented him, the terrible realization that his orders would lead to the indiscriminate annihilation of innocent lives, not merely enemies, but also their own wounded compatriots, medics, nurses, civilians. He spoke of the faces he had seen in the hospital, the fear in their eyes, and the shared humanity that transcended uniforms. Richter's confession was not an apology, but an honest account of a man confronted with the moral abyss of war. He admitted the fear he felt, not just of the approaching enemy, but also of his own hierarchy, of the repercussions for his insubordination, which could lead to court-martial and execution. He revealed the solitude of his decision, the burden of a secret that had weighed upon him for decades, a choice that saved lives but cost him his military career and, for many years, his peace of mind. He had been branded a traitor by some, but to himself, he had been a man who refused to be a tool for slaughter. Jack listened to every word, feeling the puzzle pieces finally click into place. It wasn't just about the bombs. It was about an ordinary man caught in the relentless machinery of war who chose conscience over blind obedience. It was about a moment of profound moral courage that had repercussions across continents and generations. This was not merely a reunion, it was a shared act of bearing witness. Two old soldiers from opposing sides finally able to acknowledge the true cost of war and the rare, precious acts of humanity that sometimes shone through its darkness. The conversation deepened, transcending the mere facts of that night, delving into the emotional landscapes of their lives since. They spoke of their families, of the losses they had endured, of the long winding paths that had led them to this quiet room in Bavaria. The initial tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile yet growing sense of understanding, a connection forged in the crucible of a terrible shared secret. Healing, Jack realized, had begun, not just for him, but for both of them. It was as if, in unearthing the truth, they had also unearthed the possibility of peace. That afternoon stretched on for hours, each revelation, each shared memory, weaving an invisible thread between the two men. They were, in a way, brothers of an experience few could comprehend. They were, in a peculiar way, siblings of an experience few could truly comprehend. That newfound bond, forged in the crucible of war and tempered by time, began to unravel the knots of decades of silence and suffering. For Jack, the weight of uncertainty dissipated, replaced by the clarity of a truth he had long sought. He looked at Klaus, no longer as an adversary or a distant savior, but as a man who, in an instant of absolute darkness, had chosen the light. And in that gaze, Klaus Richter found a redemption no court-martial or official absolution could have ever bestowed. Jack's validation, the simple fact that he was there, alive and grateful, was a balm to the wounds of a soul that had carried a secret burden for over half a century. Richter, with a stillness that spoke volumes, elaborated on that night's events. It wasn't just the wounded Allied soldiers like Jack who were under his reluctant care. The hospital beyond the military wards housed dozens of French civilians, women and children, who had sought refuge from the fury of the battle engulfing the village. And, crucially, many of his own countrymen, severely injured German soldiers, lay unconscious in their beds, oblivious to the deadly plot unfolding beneath their feet. "If I had followed orders," Richter confessed, his voice a mere whisper, "there would have been no distinction, all would have perished. The plan was to obliterate everything. It was not war, it was annihilation." The magnitude of his choice, Jack realized, was even greater than he had fathomed. It was not merely the life of one young American GI that had been spared, but a microcosm of humanity, of all ages, all allegiances, that Richter had, through a singular act of conscience, rescued from the abyss. The afternoon bled into night, and the conversation continued, flowing between Richter's German and Jack's English, with Helga weaving the linguistic bridge. They shared simple meals, bread and cheese, washed down with stories neither had ever confided to another soul. Richter spoke of his post-war life, the imprisonment, the quiet release, the struggle to rebuild a civilian existence under the stigma of insubordination, a euphemism for his moral defiance. He had become a civil engineer, building bridges and buildings, ironically dedicating his life to creation rather than destruction. But the shadow of that night, the secret of the choice that had defined him, had always accompanied him. He had never married, never had children, dedicating himself to meticulous work and a life of introspection. Sending the photograph to Jack, he explained, was an act of belated desperation, a desire before time completely slipped away, to share the truth with someone who would truly understand it. Jack, in turn, recounted his life in the American Midwest, his return as a wounded hero, the difficulty of readjusting, the nightmares that haunted him, the crippled leg that served as a constant reminder. He spoke of the joy his family brought him, of his wife, who had since passed, of his children and grandchildren, who were the light of his life. But he also confessed to the void, the unanswered question that had eroded his inner peace. The photograph, when it arrived, was not a shock, but a validation, a catalyst for the final quest that had brought him here. "I needed to know," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "I needed to look you in the eye and thank you, not just for me, but for all those you saved." In that moment, the boundaries between enemy and ally, between guilt and innocence, crumbled. Only two men remained, old and weary, but whose souls were being mended by a shared truth. Healing was not a singular event, but a process. And there, in that humble Bavarian kitchen, it was blossoming. It was the healing of misunderstanding, of the isolation of secrecy, of the pain of an unacknowledged debt. They discovered that war, in its brutality, had inadvertently forged an unbreakable bond, a fraternity of spirit that transcended military logic. As the night finally drew to a close, and it was time for Jack and Helga to depart, the farewell was not one of sadness, but of a profound, serene gratitude, a longer handshake, a gaze laden with meaning. "You gave me peace," Richter told Jack in German, Helga translating the words that seemed to emanate from the depths of his soul. "And you gave me truth," Jack replied, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. They knew this meeting might be their only one, given their ages and the distance, but the impact would be eternal. Jack returned to Ohio, a transformed man. The nightmares had not entirely vanished, but the fog of uncertainty that had shrouded them had begun to dissipate. He now had a name, a face, and a story for the miracle that had saved him. He spoke more openly about the war with his family, not with bitterness, but with the wisdom of one who had witnessed both the darkness and the light of humanity. Klaus, for his part, continued his quiet life in Germany, but with a new sparkle in his eyes. He had finally shared his secret, not with a priest or a therapist, but with the living proof of his decision. That encounter had freed them both from invisible prisons, allowing them to live their remaining years with a clarity and peace previously denied them. It was proof that even in the darkest corners of history, moral courage could blossom, and the pursuit of truth could, at last, bring unexpected and profound redemption. This profound truth, unearthed in a quiet Bavarian kitchen, became the bedrock for the remaining chapters of their lives. For Jack Miller, the journey back to his Ohio home wasn't just a flight across the Atlantic. It was a passage from a half-century of unresolved questions to a newfound serenity. He returned a different man, his spirit lighter, his gaze clearer. The nightmares, though they sometimes still flickered, were no longer cloaked in mystery. He now had a name, a face, and a profound understanding of the man who had, against all odds, chosen humanity over annihilation. Jack began to share his story more openly with his family, with his grandchildren gathered around, captivated by the tale of a German officer who saved an American GI and countless others. His VFW buddies, seasoned by their own wartime experiences, listened with a quiet reverence, recognizing the rare courage in Klaus Richter's impossible decision. Jack's life in his twilight years was marked by a peace he'd never fully known, a quiet dignity rooted in the knowledge that goodness could and did emerge from the darkest corners of conflict. Thousands of miles away in his modest German home, Klaus Richter also found a profound sense of release. The secret, a heavy cloak he had worn for decades, was finally lifted. Jack's gratitude, his very presence, was the absolution Richter had never sought but desperately needed. It validated his choice, confirming that the path he took, though fraught with danger and personal cost, was the right one. He continued his quiet life, but the glint in his eyes was unmistakable, a reflection of a soul at peace. He had faced his demons, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet confrontation of his own conscience, and emerged victorious. He had built bridges, literally and figuratively, connecting people and places, and now, in his final years, he had built a bridge across the chasm of war, connecting two former adversaries in a bond of shared humanity. Their reunion, a brief flicker in the vast tapestry of history, left an indelible mark on both men. It was a testament to the enduring power of moral courage, a beacon shining through the fog of war and the long shadows of time. Jack and Klaus, two old soldiers from opposing sides, had found in each other not just closure, but a shared legacy of hope. They taught us that even when the world demands brutality, the human spirit can still choose compassion. They showed that true heroism isn't always found in grand victories, but sometimes in the quiet defiance of a single individual against overwhelming darkness. Their story became a whispered legend, passed down through families, a reminder that the bonds of humanity can transcend even the deepest divisions. Though their lives, touched by the same moment of fate, eventually came to their natural close, the resonance of their story echoes still. It's a powerful testament to the choices we make and the unexpected ways those choices can ripple across generations, bringing healing where there was once only hurt. What an incredible journey we've shared, delving into a moment of profound moral courage. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more untold tales of history's quiet heroes. And as you go about your day, perhaps ask yourself, in the face of an impossible choice, what would you do?